Okay, well, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Today we have a guest. Yay. Maya Bohnhoff is here. And is it just Kaathryn, the middle one?
Kaathryn's the middle one. Middle
That's
name.
excellent. Maya Kaathryn Bohnhoff, and they are all listed bodaciously on the cover of your new novel, which is called The Antiquities Hunter.
Right.
You want to tell us a little bit about it, just to sort of orient anybody who might be listening?
Well, it's my first dive into a mystery novel or a crime novel or detective fiction or whatever you want to call that. So this mystery, there's no dead body on page one, alas, but there is a mystery involving black market antiquities, archaeologists, and a very tiny Japanese-American private investigator named Gina Suzu Miyoko, aka Tinkerbell, who is kind of roped into helping a friend figure out who is stealing antiquities that do not belong north of the border and selling them to very prestigious organizations. So it's all very I've been told it's quite a page turner. So
well,
and
I've turned a few of those pages, and I have to tell you, the pages that I saw, they were turning quite easily. So yeah, absolutely. It's got, I mean, hey, you don't need a dead body on the first page in order to have a page turner. So
yeah. Oddly, one of the editors that passed on the book asked that, why is there no dead body in the first 3 chapters? It's like, couldn't you put a murder on page 1? It's like, it's not that kind of mystery. There is a dead body, but not for a while.
Antiquity stealing is not a victimless crime.
No,
oh God,
I'm
seeing one of those DVD messages. Antiquity stealing is not a victimless crime. Please contact your local private detective if you detect any stolen antiquities.
Your local archaeologist, yeah.
Well, you know, okay, so given that this is a world building show, we're definitely going to be talking about some world building here. And what I notice just first off is this is our world, at least to a large extent, right? It's a fictional version of our world. So is this an unusual setting for you?
Well, oddly, now that I look back over my past stories, I have mostly written science fiction and fantasy, dabbled in alternate history and steampunk and whatnot. And I realized that when I have written about archaeological digs before, they have not been on this planet. They have been on other planets. So I was free to use the tools of archaeology, but use them as I pleased because I wasn't on this planet.
Interesting.
So, and I did find that kind of odd. I've always loved archaeology and really been interested in it. And I think that the world building here had to do with the substrates of our world. So I've got this whole, there's this whole upper crust, these museums and these wonderful auction houses and things, and they have their patina, that's part of the building world, is putting that piece in. And then there's the people that actually do the dirty work, so I ended up in a number of different places on this planet. And the challenge was, I think, trying to build my world and have it match the real world well enough that people would go, oh, I've been to that, or I studied that in school. I recognize that, and you didn't lie about it. You kept true to the world while building your fictional world on top of it.
Sure.
And then there's another layer to the whole Gina Miyoko stories, which is that her mom is a folklorist at science fiction, I almost said, San Francisco State University, and has this kind of belief system that she claims only to be academically interested in, but that's another story. That there's this kind of fantasy element that it kind of is layered in there because Gina's mom and dad are both into their particular culture's magic, if you will. And so one of the things that Gina has to contend with is that her mom, who is Russian Orthodox and a folklorist, and she says wants to be a witch or imagines herself to be a witch, is constantly sticking little Lucky Charms in her pockets and blessing her motorcycle and her gun.
Blessing her motorcycle? I love it.
Blessing the motorcycle, and make sure that Gina has all this arcane protection. And so part of the world that Gina operates in is a little bit of a fantasy world. And I kind of leave it up to the reader to decide whether there really is a fantasy element, because I love ambiguity. But that's a very important part of Gina's world. And also her best friend, who is the Park Service agent that draws her into this mystery, is a Hopi Indian, Native American, First Nations, and she's displaced from her, her traditional lands and living in San Francisco or in Sausalito, but she still has her own world in which she operates, and which makes this task of smoking out these, what's the word, espoliadors, smoking them out, very personal to her. So all these kind of things kind of come together. Gina's kind of a synthesis of her mom's world and her dad's world, which is kind of Buddhist, and then her own, and how much she believes in the magic. That's also up for the interpretation of the reader. So I found it really interesting to kind of take elements that I'd used in science fiction stories and fantasy stories that I'd written, and then trying to put them into, here's a real world setting.
Yeah.
Is this really operating here or is it not? You decide, dear reader.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, because there are a lot of real worlds that have worlds that resemble ours in a lot of ways that have science fictional or fantastical elements to them. So that ambiguity is definitely in operation in a lot of different contexts. So let me ask you something. I have to tell you, I'm super interested in the research that you did for this book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was interesting because this book has taken a long time for me to write and get finished, because it started with the character. And so I was kind of picking up bits and pieces. Her mom was originally going to be a psychologist, and at some point I decided she was a folklorist, and I did it when I was doing research for another book I was writing. I had this wonderful book called Bathhouse at Midnight, which is about magic in the Russian Orthodox Church. And I was fascinated by it, and I've gotten an awful lot out of that book, but one of the things I got out of it was this whole, this kind of research to back up Nadia Miyoko, Gina's mom, and her belief system and all of that. So I had those kinds of things where I was doing study in magic, and then also looking into the archaeological aspects of it. A large part of the story, at least the setup for the story, the framework, came from research that I did in Archaeology Magazine, which was one of my very favorite magazines that I subscribed to for many, many years. And they did a wonderful piece on National Park Service agents who went undercover to do exactly the kind of work that Gina's friend Rose does. And the article was about a woman who was, she had a family, had a 12-year-old daughter and this sort of thing, but she was out in the field doing this sort of, doing stings on antiquities thieves and black market dealers, and trying to nail these museums and stuff. And it was absolutely fascinating. So that gave me a large part of Rose's background and the kind of work that she did. I did a lot of research into the black market antiquities markets, where they touched on organizations like Sotheby's Auction House and some museums that have gotten in trouble for, holding on to antiquities a bit longer than they really were supposed to. The Elgin marbles come to mind that the British Museum had for many, many years, and then had to send them back to the point of origin because they realized that they were in breach of a treaty. So all kinds of research, going into those two aspects of it, but then also things like, what is it like to go to a police academy? What police academy would Gina go to if she was, living in San Francisco? How long do you have to study in a police academy in order to be able to be, to join the force, and how, that sort of thing. So I was also looking into the law enforcement ramifications of it. How are police departments structured was one of my big pieces that I got actually from being in news groups and chat rooms online. I would ask, I'd throw a thing out and go, hey, are there any police officers out there? How is your department structured? And I would get answers from, like, I think I got 3 different police officers that chimed in, and all of their departments were structured differently. So I had to kind of figure, okay, which of these structures is going to work the best with this sort of thing. I also had to figure out things, or do research into what happens when jurisdictions collide. If a crime is committed in one jurisdiction, which I'm looking at for hopefully the next novel in the series, what happens when those jurisdictions overlap? If you've got a murder that's committed in one jurisdiction by a person who lives in another jurisdiction, or maybe works in another jurisdiction, how do those police departments work together? At what point become a federal crime? That you've transported something across state lines. So there's all these different layers of research, trying to figure out, and then things like, will a cell phone work if I'm out in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula? What kind of cell phone am I going to get? Or am I going to get a special GPS phone, which was the answer in one case of, well, if we're going to go out to this archaeological site in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula, in Chiapas, actually, is where they end up the furthest side out, I can't have a regular cell phone. It's just not going to work. So, we have to have a different setup here. So all these different layers, legalities, international, what organization would have an archaeologist that would be working at one of these sites? What's that called? How do these things all work together? So it's the legal, the international, the archaeological, just all of these different aspects to it, and I was looking at Hopi culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, so that was my very first impression, just upon, like, I have this thing that I do where I kind of try to determine how many different world building threads I can find in the opening of a book. And I'm like, wow, there's lots here. You know what I'm saying? So, like, I knew that there was going to be a lot here. How did you juggle all of that? Was it a matter of just sort of getting an integrated world feeling, or was it something where you did your best with what you had and then maybe incorporated some other stuff in later drafts? What was the process like there?
Most of it I had from the initial research that I did. Just like I said, that kind of came together over a period of time. The way my system of writing works is that I have a core idea and I get wild about it and I start writing it, and then I'll stop and drag in a whole bunch of different stuff that's like, okay, I need to know this, and this, and I'll research it to the point where I feel like I can start writing about it credibly again. And the last draft of the manuscript, actually after I had finished it and sent it to my editor came back with more stuff that she wanted me to get more in depth into things that I had brought in. So it's like, oh, okay, fine. Well, let me research helicopters. How many passengers will this helicopter hold? And, this sort of thing. And does it, what does the pilot do? And what kind of a load can it carry? How many, beyond its passengers, how many 100 pounds of stuff, you know, artifacts or whatever can it hold.
Yeah.
You know, I was Gina's gun. I had a whole sheet on her gun, her motorcycle Boris that she rides is a Harley Davidson Super Glide 3 or Super Glide 2 1983 model, you know, this sort of thing. So all of these details were those things were there, where they lived, what her houseboat looked like, all of that, where her parents were. That stuff was all there. It was little things like the helicopter. You know, what type of helicopter is it? What kind of private jet does this guy that they end up, you know, kind of chasing down, you know, what does he do? What kind of artifacts, you know, will they be able to find? I mean, that kind of stuff I had done a lot of the work before. But when I was looking at specific pieces that I wanted to write about, you know, I was hoping that there might be an archaeology fan out there somewhere that would read it and go, oh my God, I recognize that mask. That's what my daughter-in-law did. I was talking to her about, she's planning my book event, so my big release party. And so I'm like, you know, telling her about these things. She goes, oh, the mask. What was there's life mask involved in it. What was this life mask? And I told her it's, you know, Shield Jaguar. And next thing she's looking it up. Oh, here it is. You know, so she finds it. And that's the kind of response I like to get, you know, for the amount of research that I do. Yeah. I'm hoping that there are readers, right, who are going, wow, yeah. There's little Easter eggs in there that are research based too, like recognizing the scene. The book opens with this very tense scene in the underbelly of a pyramid in Chiapas. And, you know, there's a point at which knowing something about the weapons people are carrying will help some readers go, uh-oh, I know who the bad guy is. But like I said, it's an Easter egg that you only get if you really, you know, I think my friends who are like really into target practice guns and stuff will go, oh, I get it. Yeah. So it's like research is one of those things. I think that it's, well, first of all, it's a deep pool that you can dive into and possibly drown in.
Yeah, for sure.
I love research, and it's like knowing when to stop and start writing, and it's sometimes difficult. And I find that there's like, it almost is like a pyramid where you've got your foundational research on the bottom that you've done for the large, you know, pieces, and then more and more detailed observances and observations and research as you go along, and realize that you need to know exactly what the uniform of a, you know, CHP officer in, you know, Ojai, or what looks like, which is not actually in the book, but, you know, that kind of
yeah.
You need to understand the underbelly of what happens when artifacts are brought to a museum. You know, what happens, who checks them in, what kind of clerks handle them, little stuff like that, that when you get to that point in a piece you're writing, you find yourself, you know, going out and looking up this really kind of arcana of your world, you know, trying to figure out.
I mean, I think part of it is just that you don't want to restrict your audience to people who don't know any better, right?
Right.
I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. You want to, I mean, the ideal is that and this is, I think, true with science, especially I think with science fiction, you know, in stories that in analog, where Stan Schmidt would actually say, you went into too much detail, science with the technology. You need to back it off, because you need to not overwhelm the people who don't understand the technology, or give the people who do understand it enough to go, that can't happen.
Yeah.
And it's like that when, especially I think more so when you're dealing, you know, obviously with the real world. And I know it bothers me when I'm reading a piece of fiction that's set in the real world, and the writer has just completely blown the socks off of reality. Not really meaning to, but we were watching something on television last night, and I went, no, that would never happen in a real police department. You know, that just would not, absolutely not happen. And it blew me right out of the story. And so it's like getting your level of research to the point that you're credible to people who know something and you're not overwhelming people who don't.
That's
You're also building enough of a world for them to be able to see it and taste it and hear it, and live in it and not be totally confused by what you've told them.
Yeah.
About the like there's touchstones, I think, too, when you build a world. You give the reader a certain number of things that just by the name you gave it, they understand what it is. And fill their space, their environment with enough of those pieces so that they're not lost when they walk into a scene. And then you can fill in the more, arcane details or alien details or fantastical details around those big pieces that you don't have to go out to your great lengths to describe because they're not brand new to the reader. When I say pyramid, people get that, right? It's like, oh, a big pointy building. I get it.
Sure.
I don't have to describe it, in great detail. But then I get to the question of, well, how do they get into the darn thing, right? It's like, okay, then I have to stop and go, okay, there has been an opening blown in the front of it in the facade, and now they've covered it up with stuff to make it look like nobody's been there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So how did researching the real world and researching this book differ from, say, your Star Wars novel and doing a world that's already been established but in fiction and not in real life?
That was actually more difficult because in some cases the information was not readily available. I mean, the cool thing about doing research in the real world, and I do research in the real world a lot obviously for fantasy novels even, or science fiction novels. There's a lot in the fantasy novels. I'm trying to build a government. I want to research real governments and see how they work instead of trying to make something else about a whole cloth. In the Star Wars world, your information came from less readily available sources, less accessible sources. I got handed a stack of essential guides to this, the GFFA, the Galaxy Far, Far Away, and actually buy, right? But Del Rey sent me this huge stack of those. And then also they gave me a CD-ROM or a DVD of their in-house encyclopedia. Well, that was fine. But fortunately I had my partner, Michael, and he knew all sorts of stuff. He'd been writing in the Star Wars universe for like a decade, and we were using his characters. And so I could go to him with stuff, but I got into one situation where I wanted to set, this was in Shadow Games, and I wanted to set part of the action in a place called Banastar Station. And I very quickly discovered that nobody knew very much about Banastar Station. It was in a comic book. It was it was referenced somewhere else, but it wasn't clear what it was. I didn't know whether it was a Dyson sphere or an orbital station. And it took me and Leland Shee, who was one of the two subject matter experts that we got from Lucas Books, basically trying to figure out, okay, what is this thing? And finally they said, well, nobody's wearing a spacesuit, so there must be breathable air. So it can't be this or that. And finally he just said, you know what, go with it. let's just decide what it is. And that's it. So you're kind of in a place where you have to make some stuff up. And even then it may be that you send the novel in and the folks at Lucas Books look at it and go, no, you can't do that in a Star Wars novel. It's not recorded anywhere, but they know it. So it's a different kind of thing where a lot of your research is figuring out what's been done, what can be done, what George Lucas let go. Like nobody gets to have a purple lightsaber, but Samuel L. Jackson because it's his favorite color, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So it comes for, it's more trying to do research, in a with black boxes, trying to find. So you're working more with individual people actually, and trying to get experts to talk to you about, because the first thing they'll tell you is don't use Wikipedia, which is actually okay to use Wikipedia, but you have to chase down your sources, the sources that they cite, and actually lay your hands on the resources. Doing a real world thing, you just go out online and say, all right, I need to know about this. What can I get on this subject? Here are 5 books and 3 magazine articles. What can I do with that? But like I said, a lot for things like fantasy novels, it's actually the real world research that helps. And I find that for a fantasy novel, I'll do twice as much, 3 times as much research as I do for a novel that's written, nominally in the real world, or technology, because I'm making so much of it up. And I have to be willing to tie down the world and then stick to my own laws of physics. Or the reader will stay with me.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Well, it's funny, I find it really interesting that you say that, because I think that many people probably believe that the more you're making up, the less research you have to do. Right? I know this is not the case, but I think there is a public perception that if you're making everything up, you don't have to do as much research.
And oddly, well, maybe not oddly, there are a lot of aspiring writers that share that view. I remember doing a writer's workshop at a convention. I couldn't tell you which convention it was because they all kind of blur together. But this guy came in with this fantasy novel, and it was like, dude, you Deus Ex Machina, and you did all this other stuff, and there's this, you changed horse, you just, wow, this isn't fantasy, it's just chaos, right? And he's like, and they said, one of the other writers said, well, how much research did you do? Because I didn't do any research, because I'm making this all up. There's no rules to follow. So that's why I write fantasy, because there aren't any rules. And the 3 of us, the pro writers, all looked at each other and kind of went, and we had to explain, no, actually, you make the rules, but then you got to stick to them. Yeah. Because if you don't, your reader's just going to hurl the book across the room, or they'll probably, get to an agent maybe, or your critique group or something, before someone hurled the book across the floor, because you weren't sticking to your own rules. And the reader then could not make any kind of reasoned judgment about what was important that you told them and what wasn't, what they should visualize a scene like, what powers a character had, and how those things, because as you go through reading a book, especially a fantasy novel, you're making all these subliminal judgments about what it is that it's possible for a character to achieve or to happen in the world. And if the writer is not sticking to the rules, then you have no reasonable hope of doing that. And then you get blindsided by, wait a minute, I didn't know that guy could fly, or have a sword tucked into his boot, and this sort of thing. I just wrote an article on serendipity of, writing by the seat of your pants, which I think is part of that thing. And I was always kind of amazed by how many writers I talked to, young writers just starting out, who thought they'd write fantasy because it would be easy, because they wouldn't have to do any research. They wouldn't have to know anything. They could just make stuff up. It's like, no, that's not how any of this works.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. So just to sort of bring in another perspective, there are some people right now doing some amazing work with magic systems that are a little squidgy, let's just say, more sort of folklore based and naturalistic, and have some unexpected qualities or things that that don't behave very strictly. But at the same time, I think that is more of a case where you start with the strictness and then you kind of branch it out into something that is based on a often, like, for example, as in the case of Laura Ann Gilman's work, on a real world sort of set of varying cultures and systems and that kind of thing. Rather than, hey, I'm coming in and making all this up. Yeah. So you do have some sort of relatively chaotic magic systems out there that work really well. But that's almost even more careful than the really strict magic systems.
Yeah. And I think, well, that kind of came in through like magical realism has that wonderful quality of all bets are off. I'm reminded of, I think, one of Allende's stories where the lady goes floating off with her laundry because there's a particularly big breeze, and all the neighbors just kind of look up and go, there goes Mrs. Dominguez again, or whatever.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is what happens in that. And I love writing magical realism because there's less of, you can bring those kind of disparate bits in, and it's almost like, oh yeah, it's almost like the attitude of the characters toward it is different. And I think what happens, like I'm thinking again of the writing of Tim Powers too, where he has a real world and then he brings in a magical system, and then he brings in another magical system that looks like it's crashing the party, but it's really got its own cohesive thing. It's just not the same cohesive thing as the other piece he's working with. But ultimately, it all makes enough sense to the reader once the reader catches up to go, oh, okay, I get it. I see what's happening now, because ultimately it's all coming toward the story. What's happening to these characters, what's the internal storyline, and I think if it's successful, it helps the reader. The reader gets it. The reader understands, even though it seems really wacky and maybe off the wall, it really does have something to do with these lives and this storyline and this environment. But where it's somebody who just thinks, oh, what the hell, I don't have to, I'll just write whatever I need to have happen at this exact moment because I want it to, kind of thing, which isn't really very satisfying to read, I think.
Not unless you're someone like Raymond Chandler, but nobody's Raymond Chandler except Raymond Chandler.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's like the Stephen King thing, who doesn't even work from an outline and tells other writers, don't do this at home. It's like
exactly.
Well, I think one of the important things that readers do as they read is they develop sets of expectations.
Yes.
And it's really about managing those expectations and having them sort of mesh somehow with the characters' expectations, perhaps, or but managing the reader expectations is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Is if you foil your reader too often with things not behaving the way they expect, it's like it can be a really cool thing if you do it once or twice in a book, and they almost, that becomes part of their expectation that there's going to be this moment when reality refuses to behave. But I think that, if you do it too often, if the whole world is just chaos and no holds barred, I'm trying to remember reading a book years and years ago. I think it might have been when Philip was a farmer book. And I finally just put it down because it was like, okay, I'm sorry, I can't keep track of all this. This is just, the world stopped making sense to me.
Well, I think, in fact, in some ways, it's cool to be thrown once, but once you start getting thrown enough times, you become desensitized and you sort of disengage.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happens. It's like, okay, it's happening again. And you lose the thread of the story, I think, too, when it happens really frequently, and you feel like you're kind of in free fall. it's almost, on a larger level, it's kind of like when a writer doesn't tell you what's in the room. And suddenly a sword comes out of nowhere, you know, it's like, and he picked up the sword. What sword?
Yeah, that was awfully convenient.
It was conveniently placed sword, you know. And I've had, because I do editing and ghostwriting as well, and I have had clients for my editing services who would, in the middle of the scene, decide that they wanted a particular article to be there. One of my favorite ones was this group of people that were entering a cave. It was like a monastery carved into the side of a mountain in the Arabian desert or someplace in the Middle East, and they're going in. And when they first walk into this room, it's like it's a cave. It's just a big cave, and then suddenly there's a writing desk, and a writing desk, yes. Just suddenly there is a writing desk, and she crosses to the writing desk, and I'm going, what? What writing desk? Excuse me? Yeah. And then the writing desk has a shelf, and then the shelf is a book, and there's, you know, and there's this stuff, and it's just like, okay, I've had clients who did that and really did mean all intention of going back and filling that in so that you knew it was there, but then they just forgot, you know, to do it. So one fellow who just said, hey, I don't know, I think I'll just pay you to do that. You figure out what needs to be there and you put it in. And I learned a lot from those experiences, actually, about what I wanted to put in the room, any room space that my characters entered, which again is part of my research. If I go into a treasure room in a pyramid in Chiapas, what does it look like? I need to let the reader know what it looks like so that I'm not pulling writing desks out of
the air.
Because I needed one suddenly, and there, you know, oh, here it is. I can just write it because I'm a writer, and that's what I do. I can just make them up.
Deus Ex writing desk.
Deus Ex writing desk.
And it's the one way in which a writing desk is not like a raven.
I was just going there myself.
A raven could literally fly into the room and light up the floor. That writing desk, not so much. Yeah.
That's really funny.
It was one of the strangest scenes I've ever read, and it was really more frightening because I realized that the poor fellow had sent this book to an agent already before he came back and said, "What's wrong with this manuscript? I can't. I don't know why I keep getting rejected." Probably these things. Yeah. And probably also the fact that you maybe forgot what month it was that you were writing in, and suddenly it was the 4th of July and there were fireworks. A really important part of research, I found something that my editor did when she went through the book, was she would write down in the margins, okay, this happened on Friday, whatever it was, and this happened a week later, so this is Friday, and then this is Saturday, and she was actually coming back to me and going, Maya, I think it would be better if they flew on Sunday instead of, because it would give more time for, so we were doing this timeline thing. And I know also for the Star Wars novels, they have continuity people that go through those, you know, line by line, looking for, okay, how many weeks has it passed since our heroes left for this spaceport, you know, whatever. So timeline research is also really important. Remembering what time of year it is, very important to world building. You don't want it to be raining on Mongo, you know. Or it was a rainy month on Mongo. Is that how the thing goes? Which, you know, because I think any world building, part of it is atmosphere. And I mean that in the sense of, do I want to give the reader a sense of this is a very solemn quest and it's, you know, it's somber. So I want the skies to be leaden gray, and I want it to be, you know, drizzly. So it's either fall or it's early spring. I want the temperatures to be very low. So it's got to be set here or here in this part of this planet. What what months, are those, so it's, this is set in, South America or Latin America. So, what is the weather like there at that time of month? So I find myself, I thank God for our devices, because it's like now it's like I don't have to go to the library. I just pick it up and go, okay, let's see, what's the weather like in Tel Aviv right now? In July.
Yeah.
What's it like in Chiapas at this time of the year? And I think that where you set a novel or a story in time and in season also has a great deal of effect on, well, certainly on the plot, but what kind of weather your characters are contending with, but also the feeling that the reader is getting from your piece. And then, making sure that you keep it where that's supposed to be, that you didn't tell the reader it was May and then suddenly there are fireworks. And at that point in the book, I had to decide, okay, do I reset the timeline, or do I say the fireworks were for Memorial Day? Just because maybe somebody would do that. It's a special fireworks.
Use any excuse for fireworks, right?
Fireworks, yeah, it's Memorial Day and the Navy's going to be celebrating, so we'll just say, yeah, that aircraft carrier's got fireworks. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think some timelines are tighter than others. And what kind of timeline is required is really different depending on whether you're, say, for example, Frodo and Sam traveling on foot to Mordor, or, or whether you've got some kind of literally ticking clock and the countdown to the bomb, and they have to find their way through the ship to the, I mean, it's actually really important.
That block.
And then it takes 3 chapters to get there, right? That happens sometimes in some novels where you've got this countdown, literally a countdown going, and it's taking them like 3 chapters to get to. I was just reading one like that, where it took these characters like what seemed like hours or days to get to this point, and I realized that it had only been supposed to have been over a span of like an hour and a half. But it was like chopped up into 3 separate chapters. And so it read like forever. And that too is also part of, trying to figure those things out for your, so you don't strand your reader in the middle of running.
There is such a thing as putting too many words on it.
Yes, spending too many words on, trying to be economical. I'm trying to figure out how I spelled Bannistar. This is how I spelled Bannistar. Is it 1 N or 2? I don't remember, but there it is. I think it's Bannistar.
Well, I ask these things because I have to write this down later.
Yeah. And I'm seeing over in the chat too, the making stuff up. I think that the cool thing about, just kind of to answer what Che was saying is, I think the thing about making stuff up, research, reading, like people ask me, what should I study to be a writer? And I like, okay, science, history, psychology, those are the big ones. Make sure you understand how history works, make sure you understand how science works, make sure you understand, basically how the world works. And then when you make stuff up, you'll be using really good, solid pieces to do it. Mm-hmm. The stuff you make up will be more reasonable and logical. And then when you take a flight of fancy and really go out, on a limb with something, which I have done, you're doing that. And it's, and there's a purpose to it. Just like you're blowing the top off of the technology or whatever it is on purpose, and you understand what laws of physics or laws of your own world maybe that you've made that you're breaking.
Yeah.
I just find that it just gives you more material to work with, and more knowledge to work with. And Morgan commented about, the truth is less credible than fiction. Oh my God, that is so true. It's like I have had one science fiction story I wanted to do based on very solid research about how long it would take a human being living in a completely dark place to lose their sense of sight. it is less than 5 years. It is a very short period of time before your brain rewires itself. And even when your sight is restored, you still can't see because you've forgotten how. Your brain has rewired itself. So you don't see a face. You see a nose, an eye, and another eye, and a mouth, and it you know. And the I wanted to
Read it again
call
yet?
the story. And I'm not sure. I mean, the research is showing it's extremely hard to get the brain to then wire itself the other way. I call the piece "Stepping Over Shadows" because that's one of the things, the behaviors that people who had their sight restored after being blind for a while did, is they had absolutely no perception of a three-dimensional or two-dimensional object. So I wrote my story and I sent it to my editor at Del Rey, and she said, "I don't believe it."
Oh dear.
No reader is going to believe that this is possible. And I said, "No, here's my research." And she said, "Yes, I see that, but the readers will still not believe it, even though it's based on solid research." And of course, we all probably have heard the thing about coincidences, which happen all the time in real life, right? But when you put them, especially if you have a large part of your plot depending on more than one, of these things, coincidences, then people kind of go, "Wait a minute, that's too convenient." That it strikes the reader like a Deus ex machina kind of situation. So, again, yes, when you make stuff up too.
The
Fireworks
problem.
Chinese New Year.
There you go.
No, I was thinking, the Tiffany problem. A common name in England in the 15th and 16th centuries to give to young women was Tiffany. But if you try to put that in a fantasy novel, no one will believe it. They'll be thrown out of the story.
Yep, it's true. And names, that's another area of research for, not just for real world novels, but certainly real world novels, certainly historical novels, is knowing what names were really popular at a given time that you're working. And if you're, even if you're setting it, in the 90s, and I remember my daughter's, her little softball team, her baseball team, when she was like 10 years old or something, there were 10 Codys in the Little Bear River Little League that year. And on her team, there was both two kids named Dakota. One kid was a boy and one kid was a girl. So the coach called them North Dakota and South Dakota. and they just had to learn to respond. And there were like Justins and Jasons and just, all this stuff. So that level of research is important for real world. But in critiquing fantasy manuscripts, I've also found that what writers will sometimes do is they will populate their culture with, and you give the culture a language sometimes, or you will at least do names. And they'll grab names from every conceivable human culture. So you've got one character who's got a name that is like from Hawaii, and another character who's got a name from Scandinavia, and they're all mixed into this thing, and they're completely different structures, verbal structures and character structures. And, it's like, pick one or two, if you want to say that there's more than one culture here, more than one tribe here, then you would have, but come up with a, and again, working from the real world, create a language base that makes sense for this culture. And if this other culture exists, then this one. And that's something that I did when I was writing the Mary series. Especially by the time I got to the third book in the series, Crystal Rose, I was looking at bringing in other cultures, or bringing another culture from a different part of their continent in, and coming up with, okay, I want a completely different language group here. And it helps, I think, when you're doing that kind of research, to do more than just make up your characters' names. Give names for their clans, names for objects, names for their money, and this sort of thing. So that, and drawing from that same language group, even if you've, done, well, and even like Tolkien is, I think, the master at this, right? All of those languages that he came up with that make sense. he drew from real world sources for all of those, but he was very consistent, being a linguist, he was very consistent in the way that he used them. And so the languages will have different characteristics. One will be more guttural and have a lot of consonants in it. Another one will be more flowing, elevated. And I think that kind of research also from the real world goes, ports very significantly into fantasy and other speculative fiction branches. I mean, obviously, working in the real world, I wanted to make sure that I was using appropriate names. I'm working on a novel right now for someone who is set in Spain. And, one of the things that I learned that I did not know, and as I was doing research with this guy, is in Spain, everybody has 3 names. They have their given name, and they have they have more than that, actually. Because I had a friend who had Santiago Rodriguez, Teresa Maria, something Cortez. There were a lot of names there, but there are 3 obligatory. You have your christening name, you have your mother's surname, first surname, and your father's first surname. And then, and it is confusing. And I have to keep reminding myself how it works. But that was important. And it was especially important to my client, who was saying, hey, this needs to be, this is the real world. This is the way the Spanish culture works. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so then those are the kinds of things that if you do real world research, it's like, okay, I may want to make up a culture where there is a similar naming structure, where we've got 3 surnames, and those or 3 names, and those names signify, different things. Your name, your family, your clan, or like my Persian friends, their names are often interchangeable. The same person can be known by several different names depending on, situation. One of those names might include where they're from, or what their father's profession was, or his father's profession was. Yeah. And those are the kinds of things I think the more real world knowledge you have, even if you weren't intentionally going to use it for this particular piece of work, it helps you make stuff up better.
It gives richness and depthness to the world. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's a lot of work because it will feel like a real world. If you're using elements that are, even if they're odd elements or seem odd to your reader, you can ground them in that, and they'll just get used to that environment, go with it.
Makes sense. Okay, well, I hate to tell you this, but it's about to be 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I have lots of pages of notes. So I'm going to say, Maya, thank you. You're amazing. This was awesome. I'm so glad you could come on the show.
It was fun. We got through technical difficulties.
You know what? We spent some solid time working out our technical stuff, but it was worth it. So I really appreciate
now I know
extra time.
Right?
Absolutely. Anyway, so perhaps you guys all already know, but we're back to Tuesdays now. So we will meet next Tuesday, and I'm not sure if I had a topic already determined for that one, but I know we have a lot that we could do. Well, I don't know. So I'm going to post it online, and we will get more specific closer to the date. I have engaged Sean Grigsby to come during October, and I will confirm the date for that in a little while, because I know I want Paul to be there, and I think it's going to be somewhere around the 15th, but I'm not sure exactly the date. So anyway, so for now, what I'll do is I'll stop the broadcast. Everybody cool?
Yep.
Thank you so much
cool.
again, Maya, for being here and telling us about your book. Everybody go look for the Antiquities Hunter. Where do we find it? When do we find it?
October 2nd, it releases, and it's just available everywhere. Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound. If you want to get the and also for print. So yeah, just your
sounds awesome.
Or
All right,
online.
we'll go look for it. It's going to be awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.